Compañeros, welcome to the SQL Data Partners podcast, the podcast dedicated to SQL Server-related topics, which is designed to help you become familiar with what's out there, how you might use those features, or ideas on how you might apply them in your environments. I am Carlos L. Chacon.
And I am Steve Stedman. We are two data professionals trying to help others get a better handle on their database environments, either through this podcast, our training, or our consulting practice. Thanks for joining us on the SQL Trail. Welcome to the show.
SQL Data Partners.
Hey, compañeros. Thanks for tuning in with us again today, episode 92. And we have an interesting discussion on SSDT planned for today.
Yes, we do. And our guest today is Kevin Cunnane, who is the program manager for SSDT at Microsoft.
That's right. So this is slightly, I guess, maybe off-center, if you will, in the sense from the DBA perspective. But I know there was kind of a hubbub, if you will, which we talked with Kevin about. But I thought it would be interesting just to kind of get some insight as to what the future for that integration with Visual Studio looks like. And that's kind of what our conversation is all about, is that making more data tools available inside the Visual Studio components.
Yep.
And, you might applaud that, or it might give you a little bit of heartburn.
Yep. And I know there's been a lot of confusion around SSDT, and I know that the conversation with Kevin certainly helped clear up some of that confusion for me.
No, exactly. And I think one of the things that I'm interested to see is just to continue it. My jaw hit the floor, and I thought, oh my gosh. They're going to let him do that, and but I think it's gotten better. And so, yeah, we'll get into the conversation with Kevin. So, let's see, compañero shoutouts. We got a couple of good comments about our episode 91 with the DBA tools team.
Yep. One of the comments that we had came from Chrissy Lemaire, who was one of the guests on that episode. And her comment said, "I love your short links. Totally easy to remember and to send people to." And that's either the SQLDataPartners.com/episode number or the SQLDataPartners.com/topic. For instance, last week it was SQLDataPartners.com/DBA tools. This week it's SQLDataPartners.com/SSDT or SQLDataPartners.com/92 for the episode number.
That's right. So for those who are following along, we are still planning that conference in October. And our news for this week is we have booked a block of rooms at the Marriott Courtyard, Norfolk, downtown. So the good folks at Marriott are going to be hosting us. Those dates will be available from Tuesday, October the 3rd through the 5th. So Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So regardless of when you want to come or go, they're available to you. So at compañeroconference.com, you can check out that information for the rate and other details there.
Yep. So for anyone who has a distance to travel, the thing to do would be to check in on that October 3rd, the night before the conference begins, and then come to our welcome reception, and then show up early and spend all day at the conference the next 2 days, head home on the 5th, or stick around and do some stuff and see the area.
Yes, that's right. It's not confirmed yet, so we can't. I don't want to talk about it yet. But we may have some post-conference activity. Should you not be able to get a flight out until the next day or whatever? Don't want to talk about it yet. But we may have some post-conference activity. Should you not be able to get a flight out until the next day or whatever? So again, we'll be looking forward to hanging out with you there in October in Norfolk. Okay, so Steve, it's time for a little SQL Server in the news.
What do we have today, Carlos?
Yeah, sometimes in order to go forward, you have to look backwards.
What do you mean by that?
So, interestingly enough, we're recording this in April. These are going to come out. It has been 1 year since extended support for SQL Server 2005 has ended. It ended on April 12th last year. And so if you're still running 2005, I pity you. No, it's not that bad. but you've been out of support there for a year. And the other April date as it relates to SQL Server was that SQL Server 2008 R2 was released. The RTM version came out on April 21st, 2010.
Okay, so a little bit of history in our SQL in the news today.
That's right. And then the last April date, which I did not remember this, and it's always one of those dates that you never are quite sure about. But sure enough, SQL Server 2014 was released on April 1st, 2014.
Very interesting. I know there's been a lot of April Fool's jokes around SQL Server.
That's
and
right.
Different things on April 1st. But yeah, that's interesting they would do that.
Yeah, and so again, kind of just looking at some of that history, I think it's kind of fun to take a look back, right? So even at 2005, so Yukon being the code name for 2005.
Yep.
Do you remember what the code name for SQL 2008 R2 was?
Oh gosh, I don't remember.
It's a mountain in Africa, Kilimanjaro.
Okay.
Was that code name. And then I'm not sure if this was necessarily the database or the technology maybe behind it, but the 2014 code name?
2014 was, oh man, you're throwing me off here today, Carlos. I haven't paid enough attention to the code names recently.
There you go. So the in memory might be a clue.
Oh, the hackathon, of course.
Hackathon. There we go.
Yeah.
So that was the code name there for 2014. So interestingly enough, at least from Wikipedia, I don't see a code name for the 2016 stuff, but vNext, which I guess is kind of funny, does have a code name. I thought vNext would have been that name, but apparently it's Helsinki, which I guess is kind of funny, does have a code name. I thought vNext would have been that name, but apparently it's Helsinki.
So the upcoming vNext is Helsinki, but the vNext after that will probably have a different code name because vNext is kind of that term that's always what's up and coming, I guess, isn't it?
That's true. That's true as well. Yeah, so we'll see lots of, I know the Linux folks, right, are chomping at the bit on that one.
Yep. And I know, I just imagine in 4 or 5 years from now, we look back at which vNext were you talking about?
Yeah, that's right.
Was that the first vNext or the next vNext?
I was there when they announced vNext. Get off my grass. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and jump into the conversation with Kevin then.
Let's do it.
So Kevin, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much for having me on.
Yes, it's great to be able to talk with the Microsoft time to chat with us today. Why don't you first go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your role at Microsoft?
Sure. So I've been working for the SQL Server team for about 5.5, 6 years now. I'm an engineer working directly on the SQL Server tools. And over my time, I've worked on a bunch of different areas, but I've kept coming back towards developer tools, specifically the SQL Server data tools that ship into Visual Studio. While sometimes I work on other things, that's always kind of something I keep coming back to. And that's what I'm hoping to talk about today.
Yes. Ultimately, that is our topic, the SQL Server data tools. Now, as we get into this, and if this is something new to you, you can maybe fast forward for just a minute or two, but we want to make a clarification potentially, because at one point, it was a bit confusing as to the name SQL Server data tools and what they meant. There was kind of two veins, one of which we were familiar with. So there was the BIDS, or the Business Intelligence Development Tools. And then there was a Visual Studio component that if you wanted to do some BI things and want on a Visual Studio, there was that. So I guess help us understand when we say SSDT now, what is it that we're talking about?
Sure. So the reasoning behind having two SSDT brands was a little bit accidental. There was a grand plan back in 2012 to unify all of the SQL tools, business intelligence and database relational, into one product. Ultimately, it didn't quite land in terms of timing. So you ended up with two products, the core SSDT, which was the relational projects, and SSDT BI for business intelligence, which a lot of people thought of just as SSDT. So with SQL Server 2016, we actually took a big step back and actually did that work to align the two together. So what you get now is if you install Visual Studio, you still get the database project and relational tooling built in since it's really used by everyone. But if you go to the web and you search for SSDT tools in one package, so it finally gets back to that thing of all of the SQL tools you might want to use in Visual Studio are SSDT. So, and when you install them, you get the choice of which ones that you want to actually use.
So then, for instance, I mean, if somebody was previously using the Business Intelligence Development Studio and they were working on reports, is that what installs now as part of Visual Studio? Or is that, for instance, part of the SSDT add-on component?
So for all of the BI tools, they are just part of the SSDT add-on. So they're not shipped with Visual Studio just because they are a little bit more optional. They're heavily used, but they have always shipped outside of Visual Studio. I would note, though, that in Visual Studio 2017, they actually have the reporting services and analysis services project types as extensions on the Visual Studio gallery. So if you don't want to go outside of Visual Studio and find it on the web, you can actually search in extensions and updates and look for the online updates and find it as extensions on the Visual Studio gallery. So if you don't want to go outside of Visual Studio and find it on the web, you can actually search in extensions and updates and look for the online updates and find them right there. So that's another improvement going forward to make it a little bit more lightweight and easy to get your tools.
So in this new environment, and you mentioned, right, that idea that the tools are going to join forces, they're going to become one product, has caused a little bit of heartburn, if you will, from the data perspective, which is most of what our listeners come from. And they're used to using SQL Server Management Studio. And now we're kind of being led into the Visual Studio side. I guess thoughts on how we can, I guess I should back up a little. That pill seems to be a little bit harder to swallow. As IT people, sometimes we are very stubborn in the way that we go about things with as much as things change. So I guess I'm curious to get some of your thoughts on how can we make that adoption a little bit easier for those who have been so traditionally used to just working in SQL Server Management Studio.
Sure. Well, I will say that SQL Server Management Studio is still hugely popular and really will continue to be so. It's the flagship of all of our tools. And if you are serious about SQL Server, just the odds are that you're going to use that. That said, some of the more modern practices, such as DevOps, continuous integration, making it easy to automatically deploy, those aren't covered in SQL Server Management Studio. So you do need to step outside your comfort zone a little bit if you want to truly embrace those. But there's a nice sliding scale of where you want to go on that. If you look at the database project systems, we have lots of functionality for producing these deployable packages that can be used in continuous integration, but you can also develop the scripts and have them ready to publish and hand off to a DBA or a more data-focused developer on your team so that they can comfortably deploy it using SSMS or using SQL CMD from the command line and do that in a more controlled fashion. So that's the first sliding step is you partner with other people on your team, they hand you off the assets and you go there. And then moving on towards, getting Git integration or TFS integration into your workflow and getting more comfortable with that, it can definitely be a little bit more of a click stop on the way. So you don't have to jump right in. You can partner with others and find ways to do this. And there are a lot of third-party tools, and also with the new Visual Studio Team Services, TFS 2015 and 2017, they're making it really easy to set up these processes so that you don't have to be a coder or somebody deep in doing these things just to get a continuous integration or continuous deployment process going. And that should hopefully keep people pretty comfortable without actually getting deep into Visual Studio, coding, all of those things.
Well, I think as you're seeing more and more opportunities, jobs, right, and these SaaS companies or organizations that are doing development that need the DevOps environments, the data folks are going to have to suck it up in a sense and get familiar with that, because it does make that process just so much easier. And I think kind of getting into and using the SQL Server projects, even as an example, it gives you another reference outside of just the database. So as you wanted to, move those objects, like you mentioned, being able to hand off the script, even maybe another variation of that is I can then go to source control and use that as a comparison before I actually end up deploying those changes. So it gives me another way to review what's happening or the changes that are going inside the database. And ultimately, for that reason, I think it's a good thing to know and to become familiar with.
That's for sure. And people build up all sorts of different solutions for this. Like you mentioned, just having changes being compared against different versions of your source controlled data and producing scripts from that is something that a number of more serious, because they build up really nice systems around that, because it gives them that control that they want, assurance for data folks, but also makes it very easy to rapidly apply changes. And, one of the big things with the DevOps movement, especially for data, is just being able to deploy your data changes at the same time as your application has huge benefits. It really helps speed things up, but application developers are really not going to always do the right thing. You need the help from data folks to make sure that you're designing things correctly. And so getting involved earlier on in that DevOps process, reviewing the changes in code review, etc., can really help make the whole team more productive.
Yeah.
Okay. So speaking of the source control side of it, so then is it with Visual Studio or with SSDT that you get the option to be able to commit your database into source control?
Sure. So it comes with Visual Studio. Visual Studio Community and Up for 2015 has source control. If you just install SSDT on its own, we put in a minimal version of Visual Studio just with the bits that we need. And unfortunately for 2015, that did not include source control packages, our source support for source control. Now with 2017, we're working on a similar external updater that will install just the pieces we need. And we are hoping to get some basic source control support in there. So that would come back to where we were in 2013 and earlier versions. But that is a little bit to be determined. But ideally, if you can use either one of the Express editions of Visual Studio 2015, which includes the SQL Server data tools for relational projects, or the Community or Up, those all have source control.
Okay. So I haven't used that source control through Visual Studio in the past, but I have used, for instance, the Redgate SQL source control through SQL Server Management Studio.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one area that you could go and just, say, point at a database and it would scan the entire database, put the whole thing into source control, broken out by object types, tables, stored procedures, functions, views, whatnot. Is that similar? Is that what the source control does in the SSDT and Visual Studio side of it as well? Or does it do something different there?
It's quite similar, but it is a little bit of a change from the Redgate source control treats the database as the source of truth still. So it manages things in source control, but you keep going back to the database for reference. With database projects in Visual Studio, if you want to start with a database, you can import the contents into a project. And that just pulls all of the files locally onto your machine where you can see them, just like source control organized. And then you would check those in to source control. But those files, we have a build process to validate all of the things that are happening and all of the contents. So often when you first import, you'll actually find all of the things that are broken in your database. Most commonly stored procedures and views that you referred to tables or columns that are no longer there. And somehow they're still working, but if you ever tried to deploy it to a different database, those would fail. That's pretty common. So yeah, with SSDT, it's a much more project-centric view of the world where you start with the project and then you deploy from there. That's the key change compared to Redgate source control.
And then deciding what you're going to do with your security as well, because you're going to import those users and own, so the owners of objects get imported. And so one of the things you're going to find out pretty quickly is, do you have a good structure for who owns all those objects in your schemas and things like that? As we mentioned, kind of moving around from environment to environment, you're going to see issues if that's not set up well.
That's correct. And one thing that we have improved on is we have much better controls when deploying on what to ignore or leave be when actually publishing. So you can pull in your users, permissions, etc. for reference, but you can actually ignore them during deployment so that they don't interfere. And if you do have different systems for different deployment environments, it's a little bit easier to configure that now.
What are the most common things that people are using the SQL Server data tools to do beyond what you would get in Management Studio, or in Visual Studio? I guess what I'm thinking there is that if there's a DBA out there who's been using SQL Server Management Studio for a long time and they're comfortable with it and they do most of what they need to do today with that mechanism, what are the things that you really need to use SSDT to be able to do that you can't do in Management Studio?
Sure. Well, especially for DBAs, there's a couple of hidden features that are worth the price of admission, we like to say. Particularly, Schema Compare is built into Visual Studio and is free. And that lets you compare two databases, contents to each other, database to project system or a DAC pack, which is the compiled version of that. And so there's great benefits there. And if you want to be able to see, hey, what's the difference between staging and production in terms of my database contents, that will give you that view and make it super easy to understand that. Similarly, we have Data Compare for if you do want to compare, for example, hey, what's the reference data looking like in these two tables that are in different hues? Those two are really huge features that a DBA might not be aware of, but give them a massive amount of benefit.
Okay, excellent. I know those are two pieces that I have in the past looked at, like third-party add-ons to try and achieve. And if that's something, I mean, I know the Schema Compare has been in there with the Visual Studio, but I didn't realize the Data Compare was in there as well. Nice.
Yeah, so both of those are there. I mean, there's a lot of the other functionality is around lightweight, project system development, but those two are useful for everybody. And Schema Compare is actually now supported in our command line tool, which is called SQL Package. That lets you deploy all of your database project information up to a database, but you can also do a number of other actions. And one of those is you can now get a saved Schema Compare file that you've developed in Visual Studio and run it through this process. Or indeed, using APIs, you can actually build up entire workflows on top of the Schema Compare engine, since we now just have a very simple API for it. So if you want to do some very simple logic, and if you're comfortable with a little bit of C# coding, very little, the kind that you would do in a PowerShell script, you can do amazing things with that.
Very nice. So with that, I mean, if someone wanted to just build a script that would tell them what's different between two servers and two SQL servers, and it would run daily and send out an email, I mean, is that the kind of thing you're talking about there that'd be real easy to do with that SQL package and a little bit of scripting?
Exactly. You can do it directly with SQL Package, where you just send out straight the report and pre-configure what type of things to exclude. Or if you needed to be more dynamic and respond to the results before formatting it for a result, that's where you might write a little script that iterated over the results and did it in a more controlled fashion.
And this is an area that I think, even though it's been in a couple of versions of Visual Studio, still appears to not be getting a lot of love. I know as we go to different conferences or talk with others that are using the projects, you ask who's using it, and it's kind of, I think there is a lot of value to moving to the SQL Server projects, integrating with the source control, components. And then of course you talked about the data comparison components. Now, one of the things, I guess maybe, I don't know if it's from the developer side, but what gets included with Visual Studio now is actually a local DB copy. Do we need to be concerned about database sprawl as we look to be using Visual Studio?
That's a good question. The nice thing with local DB is that when you're not using it for a long time, it will stop running. It spins down and just keeps a very lightweight listener that will let it spin up again. So it's not going to be using resources on your machine. That's for sure. In terms of database sprawl and all of the databases you're going to connect to there, it's only if you've got a local project in development that will create a temporary database under local DB for you.
So then with the local DB there, is that intended for desktop applications that are going to be deployed and they would just use a local database, or is it really more intended just for development purposes too?
It can be used for either. We have people using local DB for that desktop applications, lightweight, as a replacement for SQL CE or other lightweight database options. Yep. So that's one of the scenarios for it. The reason it's shipped inside Visual Studio is it really helps with your local development and debug loop. So every time you make a minor change in a project in SSDT, if you hit F5, it will deploy it up to local DB. So you can verify the deployment works. You can, edit the data in there and compare it and verify everything works. And you can even run unit tests against it to make sure that everything's working okay. So that's one of the most common scenarios. Similarly, for people who don't want to use database projects, the web application development inside Visual Studio uses local DB too. It uses that as a reference database. And when it's publishing it, it gets a snapshot of that using our technology and publishes it up. So there are a lot of different ways to develop for SQL inside Visual Studio, and it just depends on your workflow. Those web apps tend to be very simple. It gets you bootstrapped. You're not worrying about a DBA for those. And then often if you scale them up, that's when you might want to move over to a dedicated SQL project or a set of migration scripts, which are a much more controlled approach to going through things, either of those. But for rapid development, LocalDB is great for these kind of scenarios.
I mean, so it is interesting. It sounds like, again, kind of that rapid development. And I can't help but think of kind of the open source, maybe mentality or like, hey, I want to try something out and see that it's working. I know that, again, on the database side, SQL Server has made some changes to, I'll use the word compete with the MySQL because it's open source, right? From the data science perspective and so the analytics components, MySQL was being adopted much faster than SQL Server, so they've made some changes here. I almost feel like there's a similar component there to Visual Studio is, let's put the tools in here so that people can quickly kind of see if this is something they want to get bigger, and then they can use something else if they need. Is that a fair assessment there?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And we are also, by the way, working to be more transparent and open source in our tools in general, primarily with our new multi-OS tools. So we have a Visual Studio Code extension where it's being developed fully in the open. With SSMS and SSDT, people have actually asked us about, can we just open source these? They have pretty complex build systems. There's some legacy. Embrace that in any way we can in terms of extensibility points, making it easy for you to contribute, making it easy to raise issues. And like that as well, just making it easy to adopt whatever tool that you use to deploy. We want to be there and make it easy for you to develop SQL Server.
Now, you've mentioned, we said before, right? SQL Server Management Studio is not going away, right? It will be there for those who want to continue to use it. One of the things I noticed in the Visual Studio component is that the SQL Server Object Explorer is now in Visual Studio. So I guess to reverse the roles a little bit, maybe let's say I'm new, right? I'm a new DBA. I'm kind of coming up. Could Visual Studio be the tool that I learn in and grow in to manage my database?
I think, being honest, that it will be a little hard. We've had people ask, hey, why don't you merge these two? But there's a huge amount of functionality in SQL Server Management Studio around backing up, around different types of, functionality in SQL Server Management Studio around backing up, around different types of, profiling, et cetera, et cetera.
Gotcha.
There's so many different pieces of functionality there that you might need to use as a DBA that I think if you are actively managing databases, SQL Server Management Studio is still the tool that you should use. But if you're doing any kind of ad hoc development or want to, explore that kind of side of things, Visual Studio is very complementary and will work well.
Yeah, so it sounds like as a tool, right? So the wizarding components that it gives you, that's what's going to continue to be in SQL Server Management Studio, from the ability to get to the database and, kind of specific to T-SQL statements and things like that. Maybe there's more options available.
That's correct. It's just a little bit richer in that. The Visual Studio components are much more focused on kind of the developer scenarios. They have all of the common things that you might need to use if you're a developer or a lightweight DBA. But once you get into managing, dozens or hundreds of databases and doing them at scale, there's just certain things that SQL Server Management Studio will do that I think people are going to want to install it and use it.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So
very cool.
I mean, it sounds like there's a handful of different versions out there then with SSDT and Visual Studio 2017, 2016, whichever. I forget which one it was.
2015 for that one, 2013, 2012, 2010. We've been in them all. Yeah, that's correct. So one of the things that, is important to note is that what we actively develop on and ship into are the most recent two versions of Visual Studio. So that means that with Visual Studio 2017 out, we're going to keep shipping updates into that with new features. Similarly, Visual Studio 2015 will keep shipping features into that until there's a new version of Visual Studio. For Visual Studio 2013 and older, we will do security patchings that if you, in particular, if you want to use the latest versions of SQL Server 2016 or above, and SQL Server vNext, which our latest RCs are letting you use, or if you use Azure SQL DB, which tends to, keep iterating and moving on and moving forward, you should be using one of Visual Studio 2015 or Visual Studio 2017.
Yep, and I know that's an area, you mentioned the Azure databases, that's an area that I ran into it using the Azure Parallel Data Warehousing, where I needed to get a specific version of the Visual Studio that was different than what I was normally using to be able to use the tools to connect to that location.
That's correct. So for if you want to use Azure SQL Data Warehouse, you should be using Visual Studio 2015 or above, and you should just update the SQL Server data tools to the latest version. We've had support for quite a number of versions now, but obviously with Visual Studio, 2015 came out 2 years ago. SQL Data Warehouse came out. Really, you just need to update to get support for that.
Yep. Okay, great.
And one other thing to just call out on this is that with the SSDT for VS 2015 release and onwards, we do now have backwards compatibility support for previous SQL Server versions, not just in the database projects where they always were, but all of the BI project types. So the database project type, analysis services, and reporting services all have support officially for SQL Server 2008 and up. And for integration services, it's SQL Server 2012 and up. So if you do want to use this with older versions, in the past, you needed to be tied to a specific Visual Studio version. Now, our recommendation is just get the latest and we'll support your SQL Server.
Yeah, I think that's for people who need to work on multiple versions of SQL Server. That's certainly a big win there. I know, for instance, working with SSRS a few times, I've had to have several different installs to be able to work on different SQL servers at different client sites.
Well, one thing that I'd like to bring up is ignore column order support, which is a major feature people have asked for, and just to get advertising out there that this is now in SQL Server Data Tools, if that's cool. Great. So I'd like to talk about that briefly. We added in our most recent version of our SSDT or release candidate support for ignore column order. So people have been asking for this for a long time. And a little background is that if you're deploying from a database project, we try to be very accurate about making what's in your project system be what's in the database. The challenge with that is people often add in your columns in the list kind of alphabetically, or they just add one in the middle, which they don't realize will cause a data movement operation because you can't do that via T-SQL syntax. You need to always add to the end. So we finally brought back support for ignoring column order when deploying, which means that if all the columns are there, it doesn't matter what order they're in, we'll leave them be, and we'll add new columns to the end rather than, dry columns to the end rather than, doing a much longer running operation. So we'd encourage people to try the release candidate, and we do have the full version will be coming to Visual Studio 2015 as a GA within the next month or two, so keep your eye out for that. It'll go out through the regular update channels.
Okay, and that makes me feel a little bit better because I think previously in the 2015 version, that there was that option in the project, which made my heart stop a little bit, where it would go through the process of creating the new table, moving the data over, dropping the old table, and all the constraints and everything that it was needed. And I was like, oosh.
Yeah, and just to point out, we do have, so one thing that it's not built in to detect those kind of changes and warn you about it. We do have people who've built that though on top of our extensibility. So if you do want to do it, it's there. But it helps as well. We say trust but verify, where before deploying to production in particular, just make sure that somebody does review the deployment script. And if you see those kind of things and realize that this is a breaking change. So we have extensibility where you can actually do that programmatically, but that's a little bit more cumbersome than some automatic processes. So I'd suggest people can build those on top.
Right.
So then if you're doing the ignore column order, rather than the old process of renaming the table and then creating a new table and filling it up and swapping them around, it's just going to drop the new column at the end of the table if you add one.
Correct. It will just do an alter table add column and you're good to go.
Very nice. That'll be much faster, assuming that the applications using it are fine with that layout.
Yeah.
I did want to circle back around for a moment because you had talked about the different versions, that got pushed out. We talked about 2012 or 2010, right? Then 2012, 2013, 2015, which is great. Everybody's excited to see the quote unquote new Microsoft and the speed at which you guys are moving. And it's mind boggling sometimes. But I guess that does beg the question a little bit. You mentioned that the new features get into the last two versions of Visual Studio, quote, new Microsoft, and the speed at which you guys are moving. And it's mind boggling sometimes. But I guess that does beg the question a little bit. You mentioned that the new features get into the last two versions of Visual Studio. It can go pretty quickly there. I guess thoughts on how an organization would attack the idea of keeping up with the newest versions.
That's a good question, yeah. Well, one of the things that's been happening, which will hopefully make it a little easier, is that with Visual Studio 2017 in particular, the installation has become a good lot more lightweight. It installs a lot less global components, so you're less likely to run into problems if you do try out the new version while still having older versions on your with during that, if you're going up to the latest SQL Server version. When it comes to build processes, etc., one thing is that we now have a NuGet package with all of our MS build components to make it easier to have kind of a known version when you're doing your proper CI/CD, so that it builds with a standard version. That can avoid some of the trouble that you get into with these, where at least your build process will always be consistent no matter who's developing on which version. The other one is that what we've seen is that usually, because it's backwards compatible, you can have a handful of people in the team try out 2017, even if you're still on 2013. Stuff will still work, certainly on the database project side. For, I think some of the other project types, you may need to be prepared to do a one-way upgrade, so it needs to be more planned. But for the database project type, you should, in the vast majority of cases, be fine trying it out, getting maybe a mini team to do it on a certain project, and then adopting it once you realize there are no issues. And also, I a lot of things have gone to more of a subscription-based model. So have Visual Studio 2013, it should be, pretty easy to update without any pain straight up to 2017 and get using it there.
Well, awesome. Well, Kevin, thanks so much for being with us today. Any last thoughts before we move to SQL Family?
I'd encourage people, if you haven't tried already, try out the RC. Try out, it has support for SQL Server vNext. And one of the most fun parts of that is that we now have Docker support for containers. So you can install SQL Server vNext in a few seconds without it squashing anything on your machine, which is the best part of it. So just try it out there. You've got no risk of damaging anything. And it's pretty exciting to do that and give us feedback on it. We're going towards GA, so we're focusing just on the quality of the tools that will support this, even though obviously it'll be a while yet till SQL Server vNext is released. We want to be there with the tools ahead of time. So for everybody, please try that out. Please try out Visual Studio 2017 and the tools in there as well. And we look forward to hearing your feedback on it.
All
Awesome.
right. Well, let's move on to SQL Family then. So Kevin, how did you first get started with SQL Server?
That's a great question. So I have been a tools guy for a while. Before I joined Microsoft, I'd been working in a different company developing tools as part of a larger set of things. But I really enjoyed that process of getting kind of complex requirements on deep things. And when I came to join Microsoft, I had a few different areas, but this one really just sounded by far the most interesting. So I joined and I knew nothing about SQL. I had barely done any database development. So it was a little bit of a crash course learning all about it from the schema point of view. And luckily on the team that I work on, you have to learn all of the breadth and depth of how you can configure SQL Server in terms of schema changes. So that was really fun. I just love that process, and I really like the kind of people we work with in the user base. So that's been rewarding for me.
Now, if you could change one thing about SQL Server, what would it be?
That's a good question. From my side, I wish it was easier sometimes to add new features into the tools that support the latest features. So we have some really amazing things that make stuff super simple for people, such as temporal tables. Unfortunately, it can take a lot of effort to make the tools support that. So people don't realize that's why sometimes we don't always have as many new features in the tools as we'd like, because we're supporting these new SQL Server versions. And with SQL Server 2016 in particular, there was just so many features which people should try out, which we supported. Always encrypted, temporal, just a huge number. Right. So I wish it was a little cheaper to do that, just so that we could add more value for people. But on the plus side, people get to try out all of these new things, and it should all work pretty smoothly for them. So do upgrade and do try these things, because they're pretty awesome.
Very cool.
Okay. What is the best piece of career advice that you've received?
That one has me a little bit stumped. I mean, my first manager here, his best piece of life advice was buy a house because the market will be crazy, and I regret not following that one these days. In terms of career advice, I think the biggest one really was, don't be afraid to just focus on quality and always give good feedback in terms of code reviews. That's just been a huge benefit whenever I've done it. Just always be willing to ship a week later, but have it be good. And I think that stands for pretty much everything.
Okay.
Especially for somebody who's working in the tools, I'm sure you can appreciate that, as well.
Yeah. We don't like to do hot fixes. The good thing is, when we have to do them occasionally, and we can turn things around in a day now, which is amazing. So we have shipped and gone, oh, whoops, something's wrong. And by the next morning, we have a new version that's been patched, which is great. But we really don't like doing that. It hurts our customers and hurts us.
Sure. Sure. Our last question for you, Kevin, is if you could have one superhero power, what would it be and why do you want it?
I think that I would like to have the power to turn back time sometimes and just redo those decisions where you're like, oh, this is definitely what we need to do, and go into it. Specifically, sometimes we get a very principled on, oh, we must support a certain scenario, and then we spend weeks trying to do it and then realize, okay, we could have done this much quicker, a different way, or avoided doing it altogether. So I think would have gotten more done in my career if I could turn back time and change those decisions a little bit.
Yeah, and you could even turn back time and have bought a house when it was recommended by your manager.
Yeah, I should have listened. He was a very smart manager, and that's a piece of advice for everyone. If you could go back to 2011, that would be a good time to do it.
Yep. All right.
Well, Kevin, thanks so much for being on the show with us today.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yep, thanks a lot, Kevin.
So I think it's safe to say, Steve, that we are probably not the power users of the SSDT world.
Yes, that's correct. But at least we know enough now to know what we should be doing with it or what we shouldn't be doing with it.
No, that's right. And thanks again to Kevin for coming on to the program. We do appreciate it, and giving us some insights into that tool set.
Yep. One of the takeaways I have on this is that we know that Microsoft is definitely focusing on improving SSDTs and continuing to develop on it. And I know that sometimes with some of the features we get in SQL Server, you kind of wonder at some point in time whether they just put that out and then they're done with it, or is that something they're going to continue to grow over time? And SSDT appears to be one of those growth areas.
That's right. And I mentioned it, right? So some of the changes that you could make. So for example, one of the first demonstrations that I saw of it, it was basically allowing you to move data around in programs. So that idea of, I want to add a column to a table. Well, you never want to add it at the end, right? You want to add it in the middle, which doesn't work all that well. And so it would give you that ability to create the new table with the order that you wanted it, and then move all that data over. And when I saw that, I thought, oh my gosh, the developers are going to be doing this, they're going to be rolling this stuff out. And I'm not saying that it can't be done in an automated way, but I just think that you're going to want to run that through a few tests first and make sure that everything is in order. And I think that's one of the things that has been improved, and in the tool allows you to, make that a little bit easier so it's not quite so cumbersome.
Oh, yes, indeed. And that's one of those things that running it on a small table, you might get very good performance out of it. But as soon as you try it with a big amount of data, you might be in for a surprise.
You might be in for a little surprise there. I agree. Okay, so one of the other thoughts we have is we want to hear from you. Compañeros, what are you doing with SSDT? Are you a fan of it? Are you seeing some improvements in it there? Are the people around you using it? And is that making your life a little bit easier? Give us your comments. You can reach us again on the show notes for this episode at sqldatapartners.com/SSDT, or you can reach out to us via social media. Our music for SQL Server in the News is by Mansardian, used under Creative Commons. I think that's going to do it for today's episode. Thanks again for tuning in, everybody. If you want to reach out to me on Twitter, I am at Carlos L. Chacon.
And I'm on Twitter at SQLEMT. And we'll see you on the SQL Trail.